Hey everybody. So in this tutorial, we're going to talk about how a game communicates with Wwise. And so you can think of a game as having various parameters or various things that happen in the game when I go from one location to another, when I score points. And all that information is being delivered over to Wwise, and then Wwise can act on it in terms of what happens to the music. How does one object play versus another object? How is it going to affect the music in some way? And so that's what we're talking about today. And what we have open now is a very simple Tetris game. And I've gone into the layout designer and went to the game syncs. And this is sort of the synchronization between the game and Wwise. And there are four basic categories that we have: switches, states, game parameters, and triggers. And then in addition, we have events. And we'll talk about events in a minute. Let's talk about the data first, the data that's in a game. So it could be player score, it could be various other things. Let's take a look at game parameters first. So if I open up game parameters in this version of Tetris, there are two game parameters. Score, it's very common in many games, and we might use score to add layers of music. So for instance, once we reach a certain score, we might want the score to bring in a secondary layer, so the intensity sort of grows over time. In Tetris, there's another parameter called height, which is how close your Tetris pieces are to the top. And we could use that to add in layers to build things and make things more suspenseful. Each parameter, it's a number parameter, so it goes through numbers. And so points, score, are health. If you're in a combat game, health would be probably a number between, say, 0 and 100, 100 being full health and 0 being no health. And for instance, you might, with the music, when the health gets low enough, maybe turn a low pass filter on that. And so we're mimicking in Wwise the different kinds of game parameters that we have. So game parameters is one. Then we move on to states. A state is usually revolves around things like locations, like various locations, and you only can be in one location at a time. So I'm either in the forest or I'm in the castle. Additional things might be a game state, like for instance in this, you might be on the menu versus gameplay. When I'm on the menu, I want a different piece of music playing than when I'm in gameplay itself. When I win the game or when I lose the game, I also want that to change the music. So there's another part of this too. In Tetris, there are various stages. So each level has kind of a stage 1, a stage 2, and a stage 3. And we can use these two in combination with one another to, again, affect the music somehow. Switches are similar to states too, but they're individual, instantiated based on multiple things. So if they're primarily used in sound effects, and I was kind of thinking, well, how could we use them in a game like Tetris? Each shape in Tetris could have a color attached to it, and we could use those colors to influence the game. Now, since there isn't, like if there was one color, we'd probably use a state, but because each shape has its own individual color, then we'd want to use a switch. States are called global, which means you only can have one of them. Like there is just a single game state. You can't be in stage 1 and stage 3 at the same time. So those are called global parameters. They only can be you only can be in one value at a time. Whereas switches, if I have 5 shapes on the screen, each one of them could be its own color. A lot of times we use switches in sound design for footsteps. Each character in the game may be walking on a different surface, and so we want to keep track of what surface they're on. So we don't use switches as often with music, but you should be aware of them in a game. The next thing that we have is triggers. And a trigger is some type of essentially an event that happens in the game. When you're playing Tetris, a lot of things can happen, like I can move a shape to the left, I can move a shape to the right, and we can use these triggers to play stingers, for example. And stingers we actually can play quantized on a beat and things like that. So we're kind of setting up the framework of the game within Wwise so that when the game sends over information like, oh, we just cleared a row, or we flipped a shape around, or we landed a shape, what do we want to do with it? So essentially, we're kind of matching whatever's in the game over here, and then the programmers connect these so that it's sending over the data that we need. Now, what's an event? An event is similar kind of to a trigger. Triggers here like flipping a shape or landing a shape. Events are a set of actions that also get called from the game. So for instance, when the game first starts up, we might have a list of actions that set up the game or play the first piece of music or various other things. And there are lots of different actions that we can add. We can play something, we can stop something, we can pause, we can seek, we can actually call another event. So post event actually would call it another event within inside of an event. Or we could change volumes, or we could change parameters and things like that. So in a game, when the game starts up, we might want to play, a sound, or we might want to set a state. So again, the game is going to be passing these events, basically firing these events, which can be a list of actions. When you win the game, we might set the state to win. And then later on, each one of these has some parameters. Like 6 seconds later, we may decide to go back into the menu after that and things like that. So events are similar to triggers, but they are a list of actions that happen within inside of Wwise itself. So when the game starts up, we might play some things, we might reset some variables. When we when we land a shape, we could actually use that to trigger maybe a stinger. So let me show you how triggers go back to the audio tab here. So for instance, when I'm in stage 1, I might have some stingers being played on the next beat or next grid. So we can quantize things from triggers at some points too. So the main thing that you should take away is that we want to set up the data to synchronize with the game of things that might affect the music system. So location, points, various other things in the game that might trigger the music somehow. We're going to want to do either in game syncs here, which are divided into switches, states, parameters, which are numbers, and triggers, and these events here. Unity or Unreal are going to basically send in like any of these game syncs or fire off these events, which could be a list of different actions. When we go to the game menu, we might want to stop everything that's playing and restart the music, for instance. So these actions that we have, these events, consist of many different actions that we can add and change parameters and things like that. So while we're working with Wwise, it's really nice to kind of be able to work in Wwise alone by itself to simulate what's happening in the game. So we can fire off these triggers if we want, these events, and then we can customize them with different game syncs like state switches or game parameters like score or various triggers that we might have.